We are getting started. Hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm José María Moreno Soriano, PhD candidate in philosophy here, and I will be our moderator this afternoon. I would like to start by thanking you all for being here. It's Friday afternoon, so it's quite an effort to be here discussing Hegel. And I would also like to thank you, my colleagues and friends from Seminario Hegel, for making this conversation possible. I'll be brief, but I need to make a statement before we get started. It feels right to speak about Hegel here in Madrid, where, as you may know, he briefly taught in 1933 after being forced out of Germany by the Nazis. To bring him back into our conversations is, in a small way, a form of historical repair. And yes, after so many sessions devoted to that other Hegel reader who casually wrote political theology, today we tilt the balance a little. Without further ado, let me welcome and introduce our first speaker, Professor Dyzenhaus. Professor Dyzenhaus comes from University of Toronto and is one of the leading voices in public law and legal philosophy on a very alive question: how law keeps its shape under pressure. His work ranges from Weimar constitutional thought to contemporary debates on emergency powers, legality, and democratic authority. Among his many books, are Legality and Legitimacy on Schmitt, Kelsen, and Hegel in Weimar, The Constitution of Law, Legality in a Time of Emergency, on the moral resources of legality against the lure of exception, and The Long Arc of Legality, a major reflection on Hobbes, Kelsen, Hart, and the normative backbone of public law. The title of today's talk, if I got it right, is Carl Schmitt or Hermann Hegel, Ernst-Wolfgang Böckenförde on Hegel and Constituent power. Regarding our second speaker, I don't think it needs much introduction here, but I will do it nonetheless. Professor Menéndez from Universidad Complutense of Madrid works at the crossroads of legal and political thought with the same focus on European constitutionalism and the horizon of the democratic and social state. His research has tracked how European integration reframes sovereignty, citizenship, and fiscal social capacity, and what that means for democratic legitimacy. He is the author of Justifying Taxes, co-editor of the large Arena volume The European Union in Crisis or The European Union as Crisis, and the author of essays such as European Union in Constitutional Mutation, Which Citizenship, Whose Europe, and lately Numerical Rules or Political Government. That is European, between brackets, question. The title of today's talk is European Union Law through Weimar Side, Hegel, Kelsen, or Hegel. We'll proceed simply. We're going to listen to the two talks. After that, we will have a short exchange between speakers, and then we open the floor for questions. So, without further ado, you have the words, Professor Dyzenhaus. Be welcome.
Well, thank you very much. That's a lovely introduction, particularly what you said about Hegel at the beginning. And while it's tragic that he died here in 1933 at the age of 42, it is, I think, fitting to give a talk which is in a way a retrieval and resurrection of Hegel in a city in which he felt very much at home, and which was his last home after he had gone into exile from Nazi Germany. And perhaps Spain is one of the few places where I can talk to a bunch of people who actually will know quite a lot about both Carl Schmitt and Hermann Hegel, given how large they both loom in the intellectual history of public law and political thought in this place. As you can tell from, so let me also thank Professor Menéndez for accepting my invitation to invite me here. He's one of the people I think is this only the second time that we've met, or the third time?
I think the third.
The third, yeah. So on the previous occasions and then today, after some hours together, he's one of the few people whose interests I share almost entirely in common. So it's a great pleasure to be in your company again. I apologize for the fact that the only language I can speak is the one I'm speaking to you now. And also, as you will have probably detected, I don't have a standard English or Canadian accent. I was brought up and educated in apartheid South Africa, and the one way in which it's marked me throughout my career is that I have never lost that accent. And that's one of the reasons why I decided yesterday in my jet-lagged state to put together a slideshow for you. It's a very, it's not a good PowerPoint. My PowerPoints are never very good, but this is one of the worst examples of PowerPoint because I did it in a jet-lagged state, and I did it partly because I wanted to have the quotations on which I'll be relying up on the screen so that you don't have to just decipher what I'm saying to you through my thick South African accent. So I thought I would start by saying that up until the early 1990s, I knew nothing about these three people who are on the slide. So in order, the judge and constitutional lawyer, Ernst-Wolfgang Böckenförde, then we have Carl Schmitt, and then Hermann Hegel. And I went to study Weimar legal thought in Germany in the early 90s in order to find out more about what happened in Weimar legal theory, because I was just interested in the question, what was German public law thought and political thought like before 1933? I knew nothing about it. There was very little at that time written about Schmitt in English. Hegel was almost completely unknown, and I think until quite recently people knew very little about Ernst-Wolfgang Böckenförde. That has been remedied through a publication by Oxford of 2 volumes of his collected essays. I was at that time on a postdoctoral fellowship, a Humboldt Award, and last year I was again in Germany, in Berlin, on another even better Humboldt Award. And I discovered while I was in Berlin something that rather surprised me. And that is that there is in Germany, headquartered in Berlin, thriving the Carl Schmitt Society. And each year there's a lecture given in honor of Carl Schmitt. Why did I find this surprising, even shocking? I thought that even though Schmitt's name is everywhere, one wouldn't have a lecture series in Germany in honor of this person with a very problematic past, and I think a very problematic set of theoretical ideas. And so that started me thinking about something not for the first time. How is it that Carl Schmitt ends up with this huge following outside of Germany, in particular in the United States of America? It's of course clear why, with an audience like this in Spain, people will know about Carl Schmitt. But given that he was really unknown in the early 90s when I went to study Weimar legal thought in Germany, why is it that he has this exponential rise to prominence? So if you put in his name into a search in the major English-speaking newspapers, so The Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post, you'll find quite a lot of articles which mention Carl Schmitt as if everyone should know what this German political and legal theorist was on about. So how does one that explain that? And this, in a way, was the impetus for the paper. So the way the paper starts, for those of you who've read it, is with a claim which I think is too bold, but I thought it would be good to start with a rather exaggerated claim, and that is, if it weren't for some events in the 1950s, Carl Schmitt would have languished in some kind of obscurity. So Schmitt, as you probably know, because of his involvement with the Nazi regime after 1933, was prohibited after the Second World War from ever teaching. And for some years after the Second World War, there was a kind of taboo against talking about Schmitt in print. And in particular, it was completely taboo to do anything in praise of Schmitt. That taboo was broken by Ernst Forsthoff in 1958. So Forsthoff was at that time a professor at Heidelberg University, became one of the leading public law figures in Germany in the 1960s and 70s. He had, in 1933, been a convinced Nazi, a follower of Schmitt, and had in fact more or less replaced Heller at the University of Frankfurt. He was sent into the University of Frankfurt with a brief to Nazify the law faculty, a very explicit brief, turn this into a Nazi law faculty, which he then went ahead and did. In 1958, he publishes in, I think, a rather obscure journal called Christ und Welt, Christ and the World, a paper in praise of Schmitt on his 70th birthday. And towards the end of that paper, he says, as you can see on the slide, future generations may recognize that in Schmitt's work, the important thoughts of the order of a 300-year-old European epoch are once again gathered with great luminosity. There was a response to this article in praise of Schmitt by Erich Kaufmann. And Kaufmann says something which I think we need to take seriously about Schmitt and Forsthoff's adulatory essay about him. He says, "It is high time, in my view, to recognize that the great luminosity of Carl Schmitt was the shimmering and flickering light of a will-o'-wisp, which for he who followed it led into the pit of nihilism and is toying with National Socialism." So in short, if you take Schmitt's ideas too seriously, where does it take you to? It takes you to after 1933 in Germany. Now, as I mentioned in a footnote right at the end of my paper, where I have these two quotations, this was, and if you know this English expression, a bit like the kettle calling the pot black, or the pot calling the kettle black. Anyway, I shouldn't be looking to other people here for enlightenment about. It's rather hypocritical in a way for Kaufmann to be making this critique. Kaufmann was as far on the right in the 1930s as Schmitt, but he was Jewish, so he couldn't be accepted into the Nazi Party. He got out of to the United States, I think, in time, came back to Germany to teach, and here he is lecturing the Schmittians about where Schmitt's thought will take them, even though he had many of the same ideas himself in the 1930s. So it was Forsthoff who really organized the first reception of Schmitt back into some kind of respectability. But the person who I think did most of the work was the German constitutional lawyer, later a constitutional court judge, Ernst-Wolfgang Böckenförde. There's a very interesting interview that Böckenförde does late in life, and with someone, a German scholar, Dieter Gersewinkel. And in this interview, Böckenförde admits that he is largely responsible for what he calls the liberal reception of Schmitt. So turning Schmitt into something palatable for liberals, as Böckenförde thought of his work. But Böckenförde also emphasizes in this interview that he only takes certain ideas from Schmitt, and he says in the interview that he was equally influenced by Heller. And the claim that I make in the paper is that Böckenförde abused Heller and used him as a kind of camouflage for Schmittian ideas. So the basic claim which I mentioned is that without Forsthoff and Böckenförde, it might be that Schmitt would have languished in the same kind of obscurity as Heller. And so why is it that Schmitt's ideas have risen to prominence through the interventions of first Forsthoff and then Böckenförde, with Böckenförde being more important because it's Böckenförde who really manages the so-called liberal reception of Schmitt's thought. Now notice what Böckenförde says that he takes from Schmitt. He says that what he takes from him is the analysis of what representation means, the distinction between pouvoir constituant and pouvoir constitué. And he says that he told Schmitt that he considered his most important work not his constitutional theory, but the concept of the political, which Böckenförde claims is what he calls a criteriological, phenomenological analysis and not a normative theory. and then says that central to this is the distinction, Schmitt's distinction between friend and enemy. Now, I tried to say something about what this rather strange term, to my mind, criteriological, phenomenological, might mean. It's not a term of art with which I'm familiar, but I think what he's suggesting there is that Schmitt is in the process of giving us a descriptive theory, and it's important to take account of the truth of his descriptions. I think, I put this a little more harshly than I do in the paper, I think this is complete nonsense. Schmitt himself did not think of his concept of the political as a descriptive work. He saw it as deeply political, and what's more, it is normative, I think, in a rather troubling fashion. So now let me skip to the so-called Böckenförde dictum, which every German lawyer seems to be able to recite off by heart. So I don't know whether people here are familiar with the Böckenförde dictum, which is at the top of the quotation in an essay, The Rise of the State as a Process of Secularization, where Böckenförde says, "The liberal secularized state draws its life from preconditions it cannot itself guarantee." And then goes on, and I think this is all his emphasis, "That is the great gamble or bet that the liberal state has made for the sake of liberty. On the one hand, it grants to its citizens freedom, but on the other hand, it cannot itself guarantee this freedom without abandoning its liberalism and relapsing on a secularized level into the very totalitarian claim it had led away from during the confessional civil wars." I find this claim very interesting. It is the claim that liberalism might result in totalitarianism, a claim that's actually quite current today in right-wing thought in the United States of America, in Central Europe, and in the United Kingdom. Now, Böckenförde, in making this claim, issuing the Böckenförde dictum, attributes his thought in this regard to Hegel. So this gives me the excuse for presenting this paper in a Hegel seminar. So he asked the question, after he's announced his dictum, what is the state's lifeblood? Where does it find the strength to sustain itself and guarantee, and this is my emphasis, its homogeneity and the inner regulatory forces of liberty that it needs, once the binding power of religion is no longer and can no longer be essential to it? Can morality, Sittlichkeit, in the original German, be established and preserved on a this worldly secular foundation? Can the state be built on natural ethics? And then, if not, can the state, irrespective of all of that, live by fulfilling its citizens' eudaimonistic expectations? These questions lead back to a deeper question of principle. To what extent can peoples united in a state live solely on the guarantee of individual liberty, with a unifying bond antecedent to that liberty? What I've found in working on Böckenförde is that when he wishes to make a positive statement, he usually disguises it as a question. So I think his answer to all of these questions is no. Liberalism cannot survive on the basis of eudaimonistic expectations, that, as I understand it, is just people's preferences as to the good life. The state cannot be built on natural ethics alone, and people united in a state cannot live solely on the guarantee of individual liberty without a unifying bond antecedent to that liberty. And so the question becomes, where does that unifying bond come from for Böckenförde? And that's why he's interested in Hegel, because on his understanding of Hegel, which I think is probably a rather controversial understanding of Hegel, but maybe people can enlighten me about this, I'm not a Hegel scholar, for Böckenförde, that unifying bond, as Hegel understood it, can only come from Christianity, and I think this is Böckenförde's view as well, that the substantive basis of the legitimacy of the liberal state is the unifying bond in the residues of religion that remain within European states, and those residues are, of course, going to be Christian. Here's some more quotations from Böckenförde, which I'll just go over quickly. So these come from a later essay remarks on the relationship between state and religion in Hegel, where Böckenförde claims that Hegel is the last of the great thinkers who systematically addressed and discussed the question regarding the relation between state and religion within the framework of a philosophical justification of the state and a state theory. And Böckenförde's claim is that this kind of discussion has just vanished from state theory, and one of the people he regards as one of the main culprits in vanishing this question of the relationship between the legitimacy of the liberal state and religion is Hegel. And he ends his set of reflections on the same kind of theme as we saw in the set of slides from his essay on the secularization of the state. He ends his reflections by asking a question: or is the form of the secular state's existence from the perspective of the pre-political foundations of the state tantamount in the last analysis to a dance on a volcano? A very evocative phrase, right? We're dancing on this volcano, just waiting for the eruption of the fire beneath. And again, as I said just a moment ago, I think when Böckenförde asks a question, he's really giving us an answer disguised as a question, and he does think that to try to have the secular state ground itself, its legitimacy on a purely secular foundation is tantamount to a dance on a volcano. Everything is going to erupt in flames. Now, Böckenförde, when he discusses the idea of constituent power, usually refers to the idea of homogeneity and the importance of homogeneity to an understanding of constituent power. Somehow, the possession of constituent power belongs to a people that is in some important respect homogeneous. But in discussing homogeneity, he moves away from Schmittian terminology for the most part, that is, in terms of talking about homogeneity as substantive homogeneity, or the homogeneity of people who belong to the same kind, where same kind seems to mean racial kind. So he moves away from talking about homogeneity in Schmittian terms and claims that when he talks about homogeneity, he's talking about something called relative homogeneity. And he claims that to find this idea of relative homogeneity in Hegel, and in particular in this piece that Hegel wrote in response to Schmitt's first iteration of the concept of the political, which appeared in a journal in the late 1920s in Germany, so before he wrote the monograph with which we're familiar today when we think about Schmitt's The Concept of the Political. When he wrote this first iteration of the concept of the political, Hegel's Political Democracy and Social Homogeneity, published first in 1928, is a direct response to Schmitt. So when Hegel discusses homogeneity, it's in complete opposition to Schmitt's idea of homogeneity. And in particular, as you can see from the slide, in this piece, Political Democracy and Social Homogeneity, Hegel contests Schmitt's view that the friend-enemy distinction is specifically political. He not only contests it, he pours scorn on it. He points out that it is circular because without the adjective political, the distinction, he says, indicates nothing essentially political. Schmitt, he continues, is blind to the sphere of unity formation within the state as politics. And then he has, I think, this really good demolition of Schmitt, where he says, suppose that in fact all political activity could be reduced to the friend-enemy distinction, where the enemy means the one, quoting from Schmitt, who in some specially intensive sense is existentially something alien and strange, one who must be fended off and fought, if need be annihilated for the protection of the form of life appropriate to its essence. It would follow that the establishment and existence of political unity would be something altogether unpolitical. Schmitt sees only the accomplished political status, but this is not something static. On the contrary, it is something that daily has to be formed anew. And I think there's some really interesting thoughts packed into this short paragraph. Because what he's claiming there is that Schmitt, who's often seen, and we were talking about this earlier today, by people on the left as someone whose theory holds out the promise of the reinvigoration, the revitalization of politics, Heller's point is that Schmitt's thought is distinctly unpolitical. What is the bond that's formed between the leader and the people? This is a bond that's formed when the leader articulates a vision of substantive homogeneity that is appealing to some portion of the population. So politics doesn't happen until this existential moment when there's a recognition, when the people say yes to the vision that the leader has articulated. If you want a contemporary example, think of President Trump's bond with the Make America Great movement, with MAGA. This is a bond that's formed through a series of performative gestures that didn't exist until the moment that it all happened, this existential moment. So the political is born out in this moment. It's not something that's really in line with political theory, notably the political theory of democracy, where political identity is something that's formed dynamically, at least as Heller understands it. It's not this static moment where there's a bond formed between the leader and the homogeneous entity that will henceforth count as the people. So as I pointed out, Böckenförde claims that he's using Heller's account of homogeneity, styled as relative homogeneity, whereas it's crystal clear that Heller, as I've pointed out, regarded his account as part of an utter repudiation of Schmitt. And on this issue, Böckenförde himself is highly ambivalent, as one can see in this passage from a late work of Böckenförde's, where he says, however, the concept of homogeneity, even when explicitly used only in the sense of relative homogeneity, is highly suspect, at least in Germany because of its use in the Nazi period. It is taken on the flavor of a folkish or even racial sameness. And since Carl Schmitt wrote about the connection between democracy and homogeneity, today's standards of, and this is my emphasis, political correctness dictate that what he said cannot be true. This is how I understand this passage from Böckenförde. He's saying that, of course, this idea of homogeneity has a bad past. Look at how it was used during the Nazi period, where it took on the flavor of folkish or racial sameness. And we can't discuss Schmitt's understanding of the connection between democracy and homogeneity because of political correctness. So I take this as wishing, an expression of a wish that we could revive Schmitt's understanding of homogeneity, and we could do so if it weren't for standards of political correctness, because Schmitt actually had things right, even though at times Böckenförde wants to claim that he's not using Schmitt's understanding of homogeneity, but Heller's. Heller not only had no time at all for Schmitt's understanding of homogeneity, since he thought of homogeneity as a social bond. Really, for Heller, homogeneity is about political and social equality as a precondition for the political constitution of democracy. And it's the political constitution of democracy that is its legitimating basis, not the social facts about the kind of political and social order that we need in order to sustain a functioning democracy. So not only does Heller dismiss entirely Schmitt's understanding of homogeneity, but Heller also had little time for the idea of constituent power as it was developed by Schmitt. And he points out in his book, Europa und der Faschismus, which is a book that he wrote after visiting Italy in the late 1920s, he points out that the origin of the distinction between constituent power and constituted power, which is taken from CS, is usually misunderstood in political theory in his day, and if anything, it's even more misunderstood in our day, because Schmitt, as he often did with thinkers from the past, and I think you make a similar point about Schmitt and Baudin in your piece, Schmitt utterly distorted CS. And I think that recent work on CS, and I quote from some of it in the first part of my paper, really continues the line of argument that Heller had when it came to CS, when he said that CS's theory of the people as subject of pouvoir constituant is one in which this legal authority will be attributed to the will of the people only on condition that it accomplishes liberty and equality. Heller, sorry, let me just carry on this slide for a moment. When Heller writes this book in the late 1920s, Europa und der Faschismus, one of his main theoretical targets is Schmitt. Heller sees Schmitt as the person whose political and legal theory is doing perhaps the most in Germany at that time to bring about the authoritarian rule, which Heller, like others, can see on the horizon if the Weimar experiment in democracy goes wrong. So Schmitt is there, is his target there, as he is in the closing pages of Heller's posthumously published book, his Staatslehre, his Theory of State. So Heller was trying to finish this book here in Madrid. He died of a heart attack before he could finish it, and it was finished for him by his assistant at the time, Niemeyer. And in the closing pages, Heller does mention the idea of constituent power again, but he goes back to the themes of his 1928 book, I think it is, on Europe and fascism. And he points out there that this concept of constituent power is just not a concept that we need at all in democratic theory. He says the democratic organization of the Rechtsstaat, with its division of powers and guarantee of basic rights, is a political reality of the greatest political significance, for it above all effectively limits the leadership's political power through constitutional laws and secures for all members of the state people, without exception, a measure of liberties, that is, of social and political power, which can be very different, of course, according to the particular context. So that's Heller's short statement of democratic theory, why it doesn't need an idea of constituent power. And then he contrasts that with the division of state power and autocracy, which he says is in principle and reality altogether different. And here I think he is just summarizing what he takes Schmitt's political theory to amount to. He says here all state power is supposed to come from the autocrat. He alone should make all politically relevant decisions. It is obvious that this juristic principle of attribution must depart from political reality, not less but much more than the principle of people's sovereignty. For only an omniscient and omnipotent autocrat could direct with full freedom of decision the entangled mammoth organization of the contemporary state with its entangled international dependencies. And I think if one takes that paragraph, which I think is my last slide, yes, and thinks about our world today. So I've just, as I was telling Agustín earlier, I'm just finishing a book on what, let's think of it as the legal right wing in the United Kingdom. So people based mostly in Oxford, John Finnis and the people around him, who are trying, as I understand it, to move the United Kingdom to a form of authoritarian rule. And then one traces the links, and they're very clear links, between the people in the UK who are trying to do this and the people on the other side of the Atlantic, notably Adrian Vermeule at Harvard. One notices that Adrian Vermeule is very close to J.D. Vance, who is, of course, the Vice President of the United States of America. And then one looks at what Trump is trying to do with Project 2025, the weaponizing of the Justice Department, the use of the military on the streets of democratic governed cities. And one sees there someone who would like to be an omniscient and omnipotent autocrat, trying to direct with full freedom of decision the entangled mammoth organization of the contemporary state with its entangled international dependencies. That paragraph could be written today about events in our world. And so at this point, I want to hand it over to you, because I think what I've just said now chimes perfectly with the last few lines of your paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So now.
So thanks a lot. It's an immense pleasure, an immense joy to be here today with you and to be with David. It has been, even if we only have September, October, it's only 2 months. It looks like a century has passed since the beginning of the term, because of the intensity with which we have been living it here at the faculty and at the university. But in the rainy days, when it was looking not that good, it was looking to the fact that we're going to have the seminar, and we will be sharing it with David, that was giving, in a way, the academic hope in terms of the many other boring things that were going on. So I am deeply thankful for the opportunity to be to have him here and to have him discussing with us. My paper is too long. I will not deal with all the points. I will only try to show the main thrust, in a way, that relates very much to David's paper on 2 accounts at the very least. The first is that I think in both cases there is an attempt at trying to take seriously that there is a normativity and a political drive that is behind the Schmittian kind of understanding of politics and of law, and that this is something that is deeply misunderstood all the time. And this accounts for the whitewashing of Schmitt, which pops up in a way also on the debates on EU law. That would be, in a way, what I would be trying to end up with, in a way, trying to look at EU law through Heller's eyes, that are Weimar's eyes on the, let's say, progressive left kind of understanding. So the first thing is this. The second question is that there is an element of puzzlement about the different attempts at trying to construct legal theories, whether they pose as post-Schmittian, that Böckenförde in a way is trying to go beyond, but trying to keep the legacy that was worth at the same time of throwing the dirty water of Schmitt, but end up whitewashing, or those who in a way, even if they are posing as anti-Schmittian, are at the end of the day accepting part of the legacy. And this is the point I would like to start with, that is, in terms of union law, one of the most powerful theories around is Vogdandi, European society, European transformative constitutionalist kind of thing. This is powerful because he's a powerful figure institutionally, because he's the director of the Heidelberg Max Planck, and it's powerful because it has been slowly but steadily endorsed by the European Court of Justice, who has expanded, in a way, its jurisprudence and its understanding of EU law in the last 6-7 years, on the basis very much of reading Vogdandi, who presents himself as Hegelian and anti-Schmittian. I will not go into details for reasons of time, but also because if you want to read a kind of demolition of his claim to Hegel, in a way, to the heritage of Hegel, you can read the piece of Martin Laughlin in the Hague International, if you Google, it's a Hague Journal, I don't remember now.
Hague Journal of International, of the Rule of Law.
Oh, Hague Journal of the Rule of Law.
Yeah.
Here is the piece of Laughlin, and he does a very good job. I think he does not do a very good job to the extent that he's saying that this is a Kelsenian kind of understanding. Now, I don't have the time to go through all the points of Vogdandi. In the paper, I elaborate a bit more, and I'm working on a full reply to Vogdandi. But there are 2 questions that he is presenting as Hegelian. And as I'm here in the Hegel seminar, I would like to have the feedback about the extent to which they are really Hegelian. The first is the idea of constitutional law without a constitution, and even less a democratically authored constitution, and it's a presentation in a way of constitutional law as evolutionary achievement. Okay? And this is the result, I think, of reading into European law very much the story of German constitutional law after the Second World War. Something that is pretty impolite still to remind to our German colleagues is the fact that whereas Italy can tell a story of a democratically authored constitution, this is something that does not apply to Germany. There are at the very least two reasons why Germany does not have a constitution but a fundamental law. The first was that they were supposed to get a constitution when the country was reunified, so this was a provisional document. The second implicit reason is that this was not the result of a democratic constitution-making process. This, if you want a joke at this late time of Friday, Eisenhower had something to do with the actual contents of the constitution. This does not mean that the German constitution, as the German fundamental law as we have it now, does not have democratic legitimacy, but it acquired that legitimacy evolutionary. You could reconstruct the case in that sense, and essentially there was a key critical turning point that is reunification in a way, that they endorse the constitution ex post facto. So Bogdandy, in a way, is playing with this idea that fits well with his theory, in a way, that EU law, even if originally is the result of international treaties, has acquired constitutional status, and, this is the operational part, prevails over conflicting national constitutional law, even if democratically authored. You know? I come back in a second to that. The second is that he presents his theory as eminently democratic, and he is an advocate of democracy, rightly so, against the undermining of the basis of democracy in Hungary or Poland. And on that regard, I cannot but join Bogdandy in getting extremely worried about what's going on in Hungary and still is going on in Poland, even if there is a new government who has a very tall order of reverting the previous situation, and the developments still are going on in the ground. We don't have time. We could go into recent cases that show that the problem is more widespread than bad guys and good guys. But anyway, the question is that he poses as a Democrat, but he understands essentially democracy not related to any kind of strong conception of la volonté générale, the democratic collective will, processes of democratic will formation, but as a constant process of mediation. And there are many mediations, some of which have parliament at the center, other mediations don't have parliament at the center. This is something that in itself could be regarded as just another way of saying something that Habermas stresses, that is the proceduralization of democracy, and in itself will be banal even. The problem is that when it gets applied to the European Union and to a large extent to Germany, even if he's not a friend of the German Constitutional Court, this ends up putting in the same basket parliament processes of mediation, let's say, and the elaboration, explicitly lawmaking in his statement, by what he calls the apex courts, the constitutional courts, but also, for example, in the Netherlands, there is no constitutional court, so it will be the Supreme Court. And in the European case, is the European Court of Justice, that is not a constitutional court as such. I mean, it plays a constitutional role, but not. Now, these two elements are said to be Hegelian and to distinguish his approach to other approaches that rely, and on that I disagree explicitly with Bogdandy, on the understanding of democracy as having an unavoidable element of collective self-determination. So the idea of collective self-determination is the center in the theory of Bogdandy. And this results basically in an understanding of EU law which does not only have primacy, that is, that it prevails over national law on the basis that national constitutions say so, that is basically something that very obviously, apart from the Polish and the Romanian Constitutional Court at some point, is not really discussed. This is basically accepted. But what is not accepted is that this primacy is unconditional, which basically translates on a supremacy of EU law. This supremacy of EU law, Bogdandi insists, is not going to be over-comprehensive. This only applies in extreme cases, it's only in extreme kind of situations. But if we are serious about doing a legal reconstruction of the European legal field, let's call it that way, this implies at the end of the day that the ultimate source of validity of the legal order relies with a European norm, not a national norm. On this, he, despite the fact that he poses as Kelsenian, I think, again, Laughlin gets it wrong because he directly repudiates the understanding of Kelsen, because he repudiates the idea that you have to reconstruct the legal order on the basis of something similar to a change of validity that ends up in a fundamental norm of one way or the other, the hypothetical Kelsenian Grundnorm or the more Hartian kind of sociological basis of this, or the McCormick that I would claim, we don't have time for that, is pretty similar in a way to Heller in that sense, in the way of understanding the ultimate foundation of the legal order. This is, in a way, the anti-Schmittian. Now, but if you have friends like this, do you need enemies? In many ways, you could be saying. That's the reason that I think we should look to Heller for two reasons. I find extremely disappointing and in need of something else here in order to try to understand and to get a grasp on EU law. The first thing is that this repudiation of collective self-determination in terms of actual law, I'm not talking now, I know I'm a faculty of philosophy, but imagining I was in the faculty opposite, as a matter of law, European national constitutions keep on insisting on the idea of collective self-determination. And this collective self-determination does not have to lead to a close understanding of collective self-determination, but there is an element of democratic authorship that is at the basis of the understanding of the law. So even in legal terms, this is extremely problematic. It's extremely problematic, Bogdandi is German, is extremely problematic in terms of the jurisprudence of the German Federal Constitutional Court that has insisted not only on this idea of democratic authorship, but on the need, and this is actually something that implies a material content of that capacity, on the actual capacity to take relevant decisions. It's not only that we have the procedures, but it's that we can actually change the life we are living as a result of the decisions that we take. That, I think, connects immediately with the idea of social homogeneity in the sense that Heller was defending it in a way. Now, this is the legal argument. In a way, the theoretical argument has to do with the fact that I found very difficult to understand the double movement of, in a way, divorcing or decoupling. Let's use decoupling. Decoupling from a robust understanding of democracy, both constitutional law and ordinary law. I find that extremely problematic, because the question is that at that point you end up with an understanding of democracy that is devoid of democracy. I mean, the point of Bogdandi with the mediations, of course, is that they have to comply with constitutional law. You have these different strategies of mediation in society, but they have to comply with constitutional law. But where does this constitutional law come from? It's an evolutionary achievement of which the judges are mainly responsible. It's a short step towards some type of juristocracy, so to say, there. And this sounds to me difficult to reconcile with Hegel, with Kelsen, and with Schmitt. I mean, with everybody, basically, for different reasons. I'm not saying that the three were saying the same. I'm saying that for different reasons, it does not fit. What can we, in a way, and time is running very quickly, what can we get, in a way, from Heller? In the paper, I'm trying to do two things with Heller. One is trying to reconstruct his political and legal theory in something that could be characterized as 9 steps. I will not be going into that, but it's a reading of Heller in a way that tries to emphasize to what extent he was trying to insist at the very least on the absolute relevance in a way of this process through which we move from the basic, you could say, is a translation into legal and constitutional theory of the basic sociological problem, that is how to keep society together. And this kind of movement is one in which the key element and the key movement is how you move from a society that is pluralistic and made of individuals prone to conflict into the possibility of acting collectively, not only in order to solve conflicts, but also in order to achieve public goods on the basis of a coordination of our actions. I think I don't have time now to go into that. It's in the paper. Something that I would like, and I have been reflecting, because I have been doing some other stuff on the German Weimar labor lawyers, Zinsheimer and all this kind of stuff. Heller is discussing all these issues, and he's rarely, to my knowledge, talking about labor law, for example. So it's very strange in a way. It's social homogeneity, but very few about labor law, and many of his social democratic colleagues were deeply into labor law. I think the explanation there is that there is a division of labor in a way. So it would be necessary, and I'm trying to work on that, in updating the things that are there, trying to incorporate also the things that Heller was not talking about, but were part of the milieu in which he was working about. And in a way, the kind of understanding of what being a progressive jurist was at the time of Heller was very much in line that you don't reproduce the work that Zinsheimer is doing, because basically being a social democrat implies a kind of worldview in which you are also, in a way, fitting into that kind of worldview. My point on which I will spend now some minutes has to do more precisely with the question of the Kelsen versus Schmitt, which has clear consequences for my last point, that is on the EU law. Because the question is, and I think this is in full, how do you say it in English? In full agreement with the analysis, the reconstruction that David has made here and in previous works. The question is that I see very much Heller as criticizing Kelsen because not of reasons that are so much the frontal opposition of the theory of Kelsen, but of going beyond the theory of Kelsen, or trying to go further and more explicitly about certain things that Kelsen is doing, and targeting Schmitt. Even if when you write it, and we were discussing this sometimes, the upcoming young legal theorist is tempted, meaning Heller, to peck on Kelsen just in order to prove that he is also up to standards, in a way, when actually the difference between the real difference is with Schmitt, and especially David was mentioning it after the visit to Italy. I think the visit to Italy, in terms of how he sees democracy and how he sees the pledge, in a way, in Germany, is relevant. Is relevant because of what he sees in Italy and what he tells in the small book, and also because of the developments in Germany. Basically, from 28 is down the hill all the time, and the question is that the value of the Weimar Constitution from the point of view of a progressive left jurist becomes even more clear than before. Now, I think you have it in the paper. I try to show to what extent Heller is criticizing Kelsen, and is criticizing Kelsen understanding, in my view, the very point of Kelsen characterization of sovereignty or the dissolution of sovereignty into the law on the basis of the main, let's say, cultural, political contribution that this implies, that is basically an attempt in a very delicate moment to try to preserve peace and to try to overcome what is actually one of the main causes of war, that is the obvious conflict between national sovereign states in Europe. So on that regard, I don't see an element of conflict. I see an element of worrying about the consequences of this movement of dissolution of the law. He sees that even if Kelsen's pure theory of law has many salutary effects in terms of getting rid of the implicit assumptions of lawyers in Germany, which were mainly reactionary. So purifying law is purifying law also of the reactionary implicit beliefs of German lawyers. At the same time, there is a risk of cloaking the actual exercise of power. You know, the argument that at the end of the day, what we have is not sovereignty, but what we have is a legal order, runs this risk. And this is the main reason that I see for an opposition between the two. There are others, but I think this is the main drive of the thing. On terms, on the terms of Schmitt, the story is very obviously much more complicated, and is much more complicated for reasons that relate to what David was expressing before. Schmitt is a decisionist. The Nazi moment in Schmitt, I sometimes, David said that we sometimes it's clarifying to start with an exaggeration. If I would have to exaggerate, I would say that it's not so much that Hitler became a Nazi fellow traveler, that the Nazis became Schmittian fellow travelers in many ways. I mean, there was a gap here that he was filling in terms of providing, which is pretty similar in a way to the things that happen in Italy and Spain in terms of the opportunities that certain legal theorists had in order to that. But he's coming with this reactionary German conservative, the mixture of conservatives and reactionary position. Heller's characterization of sovereignty cannot but be frontally opposed to that of Schmitt, and this has, at the end of the day, much to do with the very idea of what sovereignty is about, and of course of the relation between law, politics, and power that is behind this understanding of sovereignty. He starts rescuing, I mean, David was talking about siège, and in a way the kind of, if you want to talk in terms of national labels, the kind of French twist that is also in the understanding of politics as something that is a daily reweave and made again. I think this echoes with a long tradition of French radical democratic thinking, but he's also trying to rescue Baudin from Schmitt, in the sense of saying you are not understanding that sovereignty is about limits. Sovereignty is not unlimited. This idea of unlimited sovereignty is something that then pushes us into the realm of paradoxes and make-believe in many ways. And then Schmitt was clearly somebody that in Weimar, and that's another line of criticism of Heller, was trying to play two games at the same time. The powers of the president, of the Reich president, that of course there is no time for that, but how he interprets Article 48 depends also on who is the president. Schmitt is not doing the same kind of job whenever is the president of when the old nice guy becomes the president. When Hindenburg was president, there is a different Schmitt, many ways. These powers, he's flirting with the idea of these powers being a kind of remedial powers or being constitutive powers in many ways. And this is something which Heller finds extremely problematic, and in a way was reflective of the failures of Schmitt. Clearly, when we are in a situation in which the legal system breaks down, there is a need of a legal answer, yes. But in this situation in which the legal system breaks down, Heller makes two different moves from those of Schmitt. The first thing is, very obviously, that the sovereign is not who decides in the emergency, to the extent that who decides in the emergency must be who decides on the ordinary moment. The question is, and I think this is something that has been integrated in post-war constitutional law, that what the emergency requires is a different kind of understanding of how you relate the different legal principles at stake, but does not require that you go out completely of the system. And the second question is that there are legal materials which are still there in the emergency. The emergency is not a complete vacuum in legal terms. The emergency is the situation in which legal principles play a fundamental role. But these legal principles are not created by the political authorities that have to decide. Legal principles are part of the fundamental constitution, and he was oscillating by the end of his life in terms of how to characterize the legal principles. And this would connect in a minute to the question of EU law, in a way, because the understanding here at the end of the day is of a deeply kind of democratic understanding of these principles. They are the fundamental principles of the legal order, but they are not to be decided from above. They are emerging in a way from our own social practice, and they have an element of legitimacy that is related to that. Now, Heller, therefore, provides us with an understanding of democracy that is more robust, and he provides us with an understanding of democracy that is very much related, as David explained, and I don't have to explain again, with the idea of the actual need of an experience of equality in order to render possible the institutional unfolding of a democratic constitutional system. Social homogeneity is not about a kind of pre-political identity, it's not about any kind of deep cultural understanding. It relates very much so with the modern dynamic circumstances of modern economies, so to say. And this is essential, and without it, the risk is that of re-feudalization. At the beginning of the paper, I start with two quotes. The second quote is one of these few quotes in which he is talking about the possibility of a federal Europe of one type or the other, and he's precisely saying that the alternative, in a way, could be dramatic, because what we really run the risk at the European level is that of a re-feudalization. So even the move towards Europe is ambivalent in this sense, because it can be a move in which we construct a different polity from below, or it can be a move in which we have what we now call, and I think this is an apt term, even if the theoretical developments are still to be coming perfectly, of some kind of techno-feudalism. You know, Elon Musk, or how is the name of the other guy, the Palantir guy? that is very much into Schmitt.
Oh, this chap who did his doctorate in Frankfurt. Yeah, he did his. You know that he did his doctorate in Frankfurt. What is his name?
Peter Thiel.
Oh, no, not Peter Thiel. Yeah. But Palantir, the person who's in charge of Palantir is not Peter Thiel. Thiel is one of the major stakeholders, but the person who's actually running Palantir did his doctorate in philosophy in Frankfurt and claims Habermas as one of his influences. It's a very strange set of ideas. Yeah.
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 But it's a free world. It's a free world. But Peter Thiel has been extremely active in claiming Schmitt.
Yeah.
In many ways, and he's giving strange lectures discussing the, how do you say in English, the
Antichrist.
And the catechon,
The Antichrist.
the Antichrist.
Right,
yeah, the Antichrist. This is political theology at its best, so to say. Now, the question in many ways is that I think he provides us with a robust understanding of democracy. He provides us with an understanding of the continued need, in a way, of thinking about the, democratic authorship and the relevance of democratic authorship, an understanding of what happens in situations of emergency that is not only and not so much an exception in order to go back, but situations in which the law breaks down and it needs repair on the basis of other legal materials. And he provides us a kind of guideline in order to understand how effectively and materially we can have democratic and social states in a way that has to do with social homogeneity. What does this to do with European law in 5 minutes? Now, the question is that Bogdandy is correct in saying that the internal understanding and the internal narrative of European institutions is that of a constitutional law without a constitution. There has been much talk about European constitutional law. There are even journals that are called the European Constitutional Law Review or Journal. I don't remember. Don't remember. I think it's Review. The European Constitutional Law Review. There are books that are written on European constitutional law, and Bogdandy himself has been publicizing this. There is no constitution, among other reasons, because when the French, the Dutch, and other national peoples had the choice in order to vote for something that was coming close to a constitution, they said no, and it's very difficult to make the case that there is a constitution, but still they make the case that there is constitutional law. And the claim of constitutional law has to do, as I said before, with this idea of primacy mutating into supremacy. Now, this has one side that is alluring, and it has to do with the Polish rule of law crisis. When you are confronted with the Polish rule of law crisis, the fact that the European Court of Justice defends judicial independence against the Polish Constitutional Court seems to be alluring, because if you are in favor of the rule of law, how can you not be happy about the fact that the court is reminding a very strange court? One of the wonders of Google Translate is that now I can read the rulings of the Polish Constitutional Court that are only published in Polish. And one of the rulings in which they were contesting the primacy and, of course, the supremacy of European Union law was full of quotations of the Bible, and the judges were discussing the ones with the others. So they were basically insulting each other in the judgment. That's a very weird. I have never come across such a judgment. It's very strange. One of the judges was discussing that they were not really discussing the judgment, what was authored by the rapporteur, without real discussion, this kind of stuff. So it's very weird. But anyway, how can you not be sympathetic to that kind of development? You know, of course, the devil is in the details, because what it implies in other cases. It implies in other cases, for example, the cases that were related to the Eurozone fiscal crisis, that the concerns expressed, for example, by the German Constitutional Court are to be set aside in the name of supremacy. The last word has to be with somebody and this somebody is the European Court of Justice. Now, this from the point of view of Bogdandy, I think is contradictory, because he was promising us some kind of decent pluralistic legal order, and when the chips come down, there is a need of the final word. But moreover, I think that this is extremely problematic because it runs the risk of throwing the baby with the dirty water. The dirty water is this kind of nationalistic understanding of constitutional identity epitomized by the Polish Constitutional Court. The baby, of course, is this idea of democratic author law. And on that regard, Dieter Grimm, who used to be a judge at the same time that Böckenförde at the German Constitutional Court, has insisted that he is not in the list opposing an eventual federalist transformation of Europe, but the fact of the matter is that without this federal transformation, assigning supremacy to EU law means decoupling EU law and therefore national law from a democratic source. And this is extremely problematic, to say the least. But there is more. The second question is that, and this is also a fault of the German Constitutional Court, was Bogdandy and most EU law scholarship downplays, is to what extent what we could call the constitutive power, not in the old sense, but the constitutive power of the economic constitution, of the basic decisions that you take about the economy. That is a very peculiar European thing. The economic constitution that we have in the European Union is very peculiar and very idiosyncratic in many ways. Not so much because of the different elements of the constitution that you can find in other countries, but because of the combination of what I would call the trio, in a way, the holy trinity of European economic constitutional law, which is sound money, which is very much related to an independent central bank. There are independent central banks in many other places in the world now, but the European Central Bank is among the most independent ones, for the simple reason that it's not only that they have to keep inflation low, is that they decide themselves what is low inflation in many ways. So on the one hand, you have sound economy, and it comes with financial stability, blah, blah. You have economic freedoms, which include a free movement of capital, which does not apply only within the European Union, but also outside the European Union. So it's erga omnes in the technical term. And then free competition. Okay, these three things are not only governing the economy, they are predetermining, in a way, the kind of political ordering that we have. And the three of them are deeply depoliticizing in terms of rendering impossible, both at the European and at the national level, to take decisions related to the socioeconomic structure. So we have, on the one hand, a kind of understanding of democracy that is diluted and in which sovereign power is fragmenting and pulverized. And we have, on the other hand, that this kind of project comes in a way with the consequence that the social homogeneity that in limited terms, in very improvable terms, was to a certain extent achieved in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 70s and the 80s, is being unwinded. And it's being unwinded because precisely these elements of depoliticization are rendering powerless the political process in order to respond to the kind of demands that are coming from citizens in many ways. You know very clearly, I'm talking to a generation that is experiencing huge problems in access to housing. And basically, the feeling that pervades our public discussions is also powerlessness. It cannot be done. It's not possible to limit access to property of housing of people that do not actually live in the house that they have. It's not possible to limit the influx of capital. It's not possible to introduce lots of the things that used to be possible precisely because of EU law. At the end of the day, it stops with EU law. On such a basis, and I have already talked a lot and made a mess of the presentation of a far too long paper, the question is that if we look with Hegelian eyes to the European Union, unfortunately, what we are seeing is an ambivalent European Union. During years, it was a force that was enabling national and democratic social states and was a disciplining force in terms of taming the most nationalistic and exclusionary tendencies that were still part of the member states. From the late 70s, early 80s, it has started to go down the path in a way of being the project that Hegel feared. That is the project that runs the risk of giving a boost to a kind of techno-feudal Europe. And this ambivalence means, at the same time, that it's still not too late in the game to try to exploit, quotation marks, the legal elements that are there of the old constitutional understanding and the old understanding of the European Union, but time is in a way passing very, very rapidly, and developments. We are now in the middle of rearmament Europe, and rearmament Europe is in a way something that also has a kind of Weimar flavor, very much so, and the kind of catch or the kind of trade-off is very much in the same way that the 2010s and the European fiscal crisis of the 2010 had immediate parallels with Weimar, and in a way the period of from 30 to 33 in a way of presidential governments and all this kind of stuff. The rearmament Europe in which we are entering is one in which the appeal at the end of the day is to a kind of existential identity that is defined in opposition to external enemies, of which there are increasingly more, and less on the basis of a social contract which can generate the modicum of social homogeneity that renders equality a real experience. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. We can now go further to the discussion between the speakers, if you want to say a statement against each other, or we can go directly to the questions. Professor Dyzenhaus, how you want to...
maybe I'll just say a couple of things.
Yeah, thank you.
So the first is, you didn't tell me about your interest in Sinsheimer earlier. So I'm not sure whether this name is familiar to people in this room, but he's regarded as the father of German labor law. And he was immensely influential, but his influence isn't really well known. So Heller was one of his protégés, Franz Neumann was another, Ernst Frankl was a third, the author of the Dual State. And tracing Sinsheimer's influence, I think, is actually very important to understanding the set of ideas that come out of Weimar. The second observation is that I'm not sure how often it is that the real world intrudes into this room of philosophical discussion, but there's been a lot of the real world here. And I hope that this strikes people, the philosophers in this room, as something interesting. The reason that I've spent my career studying the kinds of things that I've studied is that when I was being educated at university in apartheid South Africa, the ideas that I was learning about, especially in my political theory seminars, were ideas that mattered to the world immediately outside of the classroom. And one could see the world being shaped by people's ideas. And I think perhaps, unfortunately, we're living in that kind of time again, when ideas matter more than at previous times, when at least the so-called Western world was relatively stable and peaceful and democratic. So this brings me to Palantir. So I quickly looked up the person whose name eluded me when I just tried to think of it. His name is Alex Karp. So Alex Karp is the brains behind Palantir, and he's a person with a philosophy degree from Frankfurt University. And he is, of course, very close to Thiel. Now, Thiel, in this rather strange, I just want to get back to the slide here, in this rather strange talk that escaped the kind of privacy in which he attempted to give it with the Antichrist and Schmitt. I think this is interesting because it actually does tell one something about Schmitt. So there is a book by a Polish academic called Legutko, who's like the Dugin of Poland. He's the main intellectual force behind the Law and Justice Party. He wrote a book some years ago called The Demon in Democracy. And this book is very popular on the right in the United States of America. So what is the demon in democracy? The demon in democracy is liberalism. Liberalism is the Antichrist. Why is liberalism the Antichrist? Well, liberalism is totalitarian. Why is liberalism totalitarian? It has to do with this idea of, and I have trouble pronouncing this word, eudaimonistic expectations. What liberalism says is that the state must leave individuals to decide on the good life for themselves. So we should live according to our own personal preferences. And it then imposes that vision on all of us. And if we have a different way of life that we prize, for example, some life based on a doctrine of virtue that comes from your understanding of religion, that way of life is threatened by liberalism. You have to privatize your sense of what's good. The people who might belong to your faith community will constantly be tempted to leave the faith community and go in search of other ideas by the liberal world around them, where these individuals are all seeking to maximize the good for themselves. And this is why liberalism is regarded as totalitarian. And what does that have to do with Schmitt? So this has to do with your remark, which I quite liked, Hitler as a fellow traveler of Schmitt. Why is Schmitt a deeply normative political theorist in contrast to the description that Böckenförde gives us of him? So as I point out in the paper that was circulated, and this is a point I've made before, I think that Schmitt's political normative commitments are best described, and I know this is a rather cumbersome title, as the commitments of what I call a negatively prescriptive theory. And what is a negatively prescriptive theory? It doesn't tell you the content of the good that the ruler will realize after the event that puts someone in charge of us all. But it does tell us something about what can't enter the conception of the common good, and that is liberalism. So another more banal way of putting the point about negatively prescriptive theory is it's anything but liberalism. So as long as your idea of the common good is illiberal, it doesn't matter how you fill in the content of the common good. And I think this explains why Schmitt, after 1933, can join up enthusiastically with the Nazis. So, of course, even though he had been involved with a group of Weimar aristocrats who were trying to crush the Nazis at the same time as they were trying to get rid of the socialists, the communists, and parliamentary democracy, even though he was part of that group, he joins up with the Nazis, I think in large part because he was just an awful man and a complete opportunist, but also because he can't see any difference in principle. He can't distinguish his own vision of the good from the Nazi vision, because his vision of the good is completely empty, except for the prohibition on liberalism being part of the conception of the common good. So I think this is what tells us what Schmitt's real normative commitments are, and it does have quite a lot to do with what people like Peter Thiel are saying. Yeah. And just one last remark, unfortunately, there are a lot of very reactionary, influential people in our world today who share their background with me. So Elon Musk is South African, Peter Thiel was brought up in Southwest Africa and Namibia, and these are people who are hankering after a past that dates back to the 1950s and 1960s in Southern Africa, trying to recreate that, I think, in the United States of America.
Yeah, no, I think what you said is extremely relevant, and it touches, it crosses, when you were talking about that, I was going immediately into the point that is a very anti-political theology point, that there is always this remnant or this latency of something that is religious in one way or the other, or is organic in one way or the other, and of which we cannot get rid of. There is this kind of element. We had in the faculty, I think it was last year, Prete Rossi that was insisting and is voicing this kind of thing. And I think there is the element that shows that the Schmittians, including the names that you were referring, have a kind of nostalgic twist to this, because among other things, what they cannot reconcile themselves is that it's not so much the liberals that are killing these remnants. Voltaire was doing his job and this kind of stuff, but this is not mainly, it's a question that they are simply fading away. So there is an element of trying to recreate a past that never was, or there is this kind of nostalgia for what never was. I think that is clear, and that what is surprising in a way is that it also pops up in the left in many ways. And I think it relates to a point that we have not discussed, but I think it is in many ways essential in our present discussions. That is the very difficult relationship that the Schmitt had towards what I was referring in the European case, the economic constitution, private property, capitalism, and this kind of stuff. Because on the one hand, it's very clear, and we were talking about the strong state, sound economy thing, and there is nomos of the earth and this kind of stuff. There is an element of this kind of conservative reactionary society that of course has property in one way or the other at the basis, but this is deeply related to a certain understanding of capitalism that has little to do with markets as such, because markets, first markets exist not only in capitalism potentially, but had existed before capitalism, and they could exist in other kind of societies. And if there is any point in the kind of Hayekian reconstruction of the production of knowledge, in the kind of understanding of the potentiality of property in order to emancipate people and this kind of stuff, is not related to capitalism, it's related to markets. And they are not necessarily the same thing. It's the point of Smith. Capitalists hate markets because they want to be monopolies. And all the peoples that you were mentioning basically fit into this kind of understanding. And also because the kind of understanding that they have to markets is deeply feudal in one way or the other. The kind of understanding of property of Elon Musk is deeply feudal. It has nothing to do in a way with a modern understanding of property. And I think this is something that when I'm discussing with the Schmittians, it becomes extremely fishy, because on the one hand they present Schmitt from this kind of left understanding as deeply contesting in a way the kind of so-called American way of doing things, but at the same time this kind of reactionary understanding already included this kind of understanding of property. And the connection there, I think, is via Hobbes in many ways. It's a twisted reading of Hobbes that the Schmitt is providing, or a reading that is putting Hobbes in the light that he wants to get it in order to make his point.
Well, thank you very much. We now open the time for questions from the public. So, if anybody wants to, feel free to do it. Okay, not that much. I'm gonna try to steer up the debate, making some questions. First of all, as this is organized as a workshop around Hegel, I would like to kind of criticize Böckenförde's understanding of Hegel's, because, and it comes properly this quotation here, because that's the exact part I want to discuss. What I think Böckenförde does is putting all the power of the pre-politics on religious thinking. I understand that religion is a fundamental part of Hegel's thought, but I don't think that it's the element of discussion here. I would say that when Hegel's talking about this pre-politics thing that maintain the order of liberal state, it's talking about ethicity, about this whole family, people, and at the end, civil society. Well, civil society comes after ethicity, right? Well, okay. The issue here is that this discussion around ethicity is already in Hegel's work. I would like to read some quotation that I have here. I'm sorry, but it's all in Spanish, but it's the one we were discussing this Monday with Villacañas. So I'll try to translate it later. Esto es Villacañas hablando sobre Hegel, criticando a Fichte. En Fichte, el derecho tiene que sobrevivir, aunque la confianza, el placer y el amor, todas las potencias de una genuina identidad ética, sean extirpadas de cuajo. Esta era su crítica a Fichte, con su comprensión del derecho como reflexividad continua que revisa los contratos. De este modo, Hegel llegaba a una posición que estaba en las puertas de asegurar que el derecho requiere la soberanía, cierto, pero que ésta, como estructura jurídica, exige para tener validez y eficacia que no se extirpen la genuina identidad ética, que siempre está más allá del contrato. So with this we can see that the Böckenförde's paradox is already in Hegel's work, and it's all about ethicity. So first statement, Böckenförde does not read properly Hegel in this part, but also what I want to ask, and sorry for this long preparation, is that how is Heller reading Hegel when he talks about sovereignty? Because in Heller there is this understanding of homogeneity, but I don't know to what extent this homogeneity goes. If it's that's rooted on the nation-state construction as Hegel's, and with the, like all these grandiloquent words of destiny of the people and blood of the people and so on, or does Heller really separate this part for its claims? Because when you read on sovereign, there is this kind of flavor of the German Volk, even if it's not a racial thing, even if it's not. But to what extent the homogeneity in Heller is useful for today's understanding of how society and heterogeneity and pluralism really works, in difference to what Hegel was watching. So that would be kind of the debate. Yeah, if anybody has, yeah, feel free.
Yes?
Thank you.
Okay. First, thank you all for your presentation. I believe they are of a crucial importance of a seminar that has spent 2 years reading the philosophy of right, and still in some sense remains caught within it. What are we trying to do here? I think that we are afraid, or maybe I am afraid. I think that the Palantir guy and Elon Musk and maybe Peter Thiel, they are trying in a way to solve the Böckenförde dictum. They have some kind of solution to it. They are proposing some kind of way, a big picture. They are offering a thing that the left cannot offer right now. So we are looking back to Heller, Kelsen, Schmitt, even Hegel, to find again a way out of this complex oppositorum that they are giving us, these right-wing guys. Let me try to put it in this way, because it has always been somewhat of a mystery for me, this ending of the Böckenförde article, and I think that we are trying not to do what Habermas did. Habermas, as all of you know, would say quite the opposite at the beginning of his theory of communicative action. It was something like, if I opt here for Kant and his Rechtslehre rather than for Hegel, it is because of the height into which Hegel's concept of Sinnlichkeit leads us. I would say that both of your presentations share a deeply Hegelian intuition, that is, without an ethical substance that brings freedom and community, liberalism dissolves into abstract formalism, perhaps even into nihilism, while decisionism disguises itself as realism. So, could we not think that Böckenförde's recourse to Hegel precisely seeks to remedy the normative deficit that, in Hegel's eyes, would be common to both Kelsen and Schmitt, and if, as Adorno once suggested, we place our present before Hegel, not Hegel in our world, both our world, but our world before Hegel, would Böckenförde not see in both Schmitt and Kelsen two expressions of the same nihilism, and also Hegel? Because what about Hegel? It seems to me that Hegel would regard his conceptions, Hegel's conceptions, as a merely sociological homogeneity, that is, ethical life lost at the extremes, also some kind of second-level nihilism. It is possible that Böckenförde appeals to Hegel is simply an attempt to find a way out of what, even in Hegel, would appear to Hegel as a form of sociological nihilism. That is my question. And I think that for Böckenförde, and even for Hegel, and that is why I think that Böckenförde look to Hegel is right, they are thinking that Kelsen, Schmitt, and Hegel share the same kind of nihilism. I also would like to ask, do you think that we are trying to find weapons to fight against this solution of the Böckenförde dictum that are trying to find this Elon Musk kind of people? Thank you for the presentation. I'm sorry for my English, I only use it for reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I have a much less researched question. Is the new rearmament of Europe with the ambition of self-determination as a successful replacement for the religion as a basis of state determination?
Yeah, so let me try to give an inadequate response to the two questions about Hegel, and then you can respond to those as well, and then you can deal with the one which only you can respond to, which is your question. So I don't. I've spent a lot of time reading the philosophy of right, both as an undergraduate, and then when I arrived at the University of Toronto, there's a law and philosophy reading group in my faculty, and they were halfway through the philosophy of right when I arrived, and we spent another 2 years before we finished the philosophy of right. So I agree that it's a work that repays all the attention one can give it. And I have been in my time, and still today, very sympathetic to Hegelian understanding of something like ethical substance and the need for it. And I do think that the reason what one could cite plausibly as a reason why the two of us have presented the papers that we presented today, that reason does lie in fear, right? I mean, I am more frightened, I think, than I've ever been about the state of our world today. And part of why I'm so fearful is that I see people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Alex Karp as winning. Why? Because they do actually have a substantive vision of how to change our world. And difficult for people broadly on the left to find a substantive vision to oppose theirs. And that's one reason why one might have recourse to these people from the past in an effort to get some inspiration for our world today. And your more charitable reading of Böckenförde than mine, because mine's completely uncharitable, I think there is something to it. But I don't think that the answer which Böckenförde purports to find in Hegel, and which he doesn't himself give, but that's the answer he finds in Hegel. And it's the answer that you, I think, disagree with when it comes to just Hegel interpretation, is that we'll find that answer through a recovery of some kind of old way of Christian thinking about the common good. I don't think that's what Hegel was advocating. I don't think that Böckenförde himself was advocating that, but it's difficult to see how he could avoid it given what he has himself to say about issues like ethical substance. So if we don't think, and I think one can say this without casting any aspersions on the faith of anyone who belongs to a faith community, I don't think the answer is to be found in religion. So the question is then, where do we find it? Is Heller a nihilist? I'm not so sure. There is something in common, perhaps, between what sometimes people on the right claim to be offering and what people on the left used to claim that they were offering. And that is the recovery of some kind of social equality. So is it nihilism to say that it's very important, ethically speaking, that the people who are mostly in the age group of the people who are attending the talks today probably think that they will never be able to afford a home? Is it nihilism to say that there's something goes wrong ethically with our civic bond if people are fearful of the future, see no hope for a successful career, worry about the environment, and so on? So these are all, I think, important elements that we can take into account if we're trying to construct a conception of the common good that can form the ethical basis for a political project. And so I think I'll end there. I just wanted to say one thing about one of the points that Agustín made towards the end of his presentation. So when you talked about these rather fragmentary thoughts that Heller has towards the end of his Staatslehre about ethical fundamental principles of law, which is not a new thought for him. I think he had already set it out in earlier work, but he never really tells us much about what he thinks these ethical fundamental principles are, other than that they have something to do with equality. There is there, I think, a kind of Hegelian element to Heller's thought, because how do we know, and this is maybe what you were describing as sociological, how do we know that these are important elements of normative thought? Why? Because people have come through their practices and customs to show that they think these are very important elements of the bonds that might make society hold together, some kind of social contract. And so I think it's quite hard to make the case that this is a genuine normativity, but I think that's the case that has to be made.
Yeah. No, I think, I don't know if I can describe myself as being afraid or terribly shocked, more than afraid, about this kind of techno-feudal guys. But still, I think when I look both at the tram galaxy, or when I look to the conservative Farage galaxy, the splinters from the Tory party that basically now are overcoming the Tory party in the polls and this kind of stuff. Or when I look to our own Ayuso boys, so to say, I see two different things. And I see that they are, in many ways, a coalition, because I see hyper-individualistic people that offer a certain type of answer to the problem, and I see a deep longing for community in other people. I mean, for example, Vance, whether he believes or not, he's standing for this kind of longing for community. That was escenified in a dramatic way in this extremely surreal thing that was the funeral for Kirk. That the people there were willing for some form of genuine community, I think to me was clear, crystal clear at that point. That has little to do with the kind of understanding, for example, of Musk, or the kind of solutions that Musk will be providing. Now the question is, probably it's a completely far out thought, but I completely agree with David on the question of the centrality of these kind of moral practices that are underpinning the whole social edifice, and then that Heller is trying to struggle to define what kind of position has, and that in post-war constitutional law, rightly or wrongly, they have incorporated into the Constitution. Then we have discussion of when they are legal principles, if they stop being moral principles, and what is the relationship between the two, and this kind of stuff, and this deals us in all kind of discussions. But this is something that in a more optimistic way, for obvious historical reasons, is also in the first roles, very clearly, because the outline for a decision procedure in ethics, at the end of the day, is relying on the idea of the moral practice of the community. This is a kind of communitarian element into Rawls the liberal in many ways, but it's there. Now the question is, and then biting the bullet of Antonio's question, is this something that the left can be building upon, or very obviously, as you were pointing, and that's a reason to be afraid, we are clearly in a situation of crisis, and there are some people that have very concrete plans about how to go about them. And the problem is that either we come with an alternative, or people are going to be relying on them because they pretend that they know where to go. I mean, we were discussing this. This is the case of Millet is very clear in that regard. He had a lunatic plan to start with, but he had a plan. The other guys didn't have a plan. He won the elections. That's basically, I'm simplifying a lot, but that's it. I think how you build from there, I will agree with David that religion, in terms at the very least of institutionalized religion, has very few to do with that. But the problem is the French sociologists, especially Emmanuel Todd, have been working a lot on this idea of zombie religion. That is what is left of religion when religion is fading away. And the question is that you have to work on that, not because it's religious, but because religion was playing a certain social role and an integrative role that has to be played by something else that is not necessarily religion. Now, the question is, and I think that's the catch with the technologies, any kind of hope of actually activating that requires that we are able to rebuild actual politics. And actual politics, I'm sounding very Hellerian on that, requires building parties. The idea of movements, the parties are old-fashioned, the parties are authoritarian, all this kind of stuff. It's true that they have these kind of elements, but you need the political parties, and I am not seeing political parties around as such. And the second question is that you have to focus. This is the very old point that Blue Labour was trying to make in the UK. I have many problems with. I like Maurice Glassman Personally, I have many problems with his positions, and of late, I think he has gone cuckoo in terms of his positions. But the very basic question of really taking seriously listening to what people are saying and not demeaning what the people are saying, I think this is essential, and this is not happening. This is not happening enough. I think so. This is a very incomplete and underwhelming in theoretical terms answer. On the question of the EU religion and defense, I think defense. Well, what time is it? Almost 7. So it's Friday and almost 7, so I can simplify on that. But the question is that rearmament is very strange, because they are saying to us that Russia is an existential threat and we get ready in 5 years. So if Putin is really such an existential threat, he will attack immediately because we are not ready. So it's a very strange kind of argument. It's a very strange kind of argument. I'm not saying that Putin is my cup of tea. I'm not saying that Putin is a good guy. I'm not saying anything of that. From the moment in which he started the war in Chechnya, it was clear what kind of guy this was and this kind of stuff. But the question is, we will be ready in 5 years, goes in contradiction to we have an existential threat now. They don't hang together. And at the same time, if you go into the debates in Germany on the amendment of the fundamental law in order to introduce the possibility of defense, it's very explicit how the conservatives, the social democrats, and especially the Greens go about the fact that this is about reindustrialization of Germany. But this is something that implies a shift of resources from one part of the society to another. Add to that, to make things extremely weird, the joint statement of August 21st between von der Leyen and Trump, that then was translated into kind of legal form, and that basically commits the European Union to buy massive amounts of arms from the US. So the whole idea of strategic sovereignty goes through the window by that, because you are not going to be developing your own capacity to defend yourself. You are going to subcontract that to the US, and no steps are foreseen in order to have autonomous European defense, but is under NATO. So the key question here, I don't think, is so much strategic autonomy or the existential threat as such. I think the key question is the building of identity, but in a way that has little to do with the social homogeneity that we were talking. It's not a we feeling that allows people to be sympathetic towards each other and to recognize each other as members of a political community, which would be incompatible with a kind of racist, xenophobic attitude regarding immigrants and refugees and this kind of stuff that I don't see happening. On the contrary, it's a kind of identity building on the basis of the cheapest resource, in a way, of mobilizing national identities only projected to the European level. But this has very few to do with the kind of federalist project, Altiero Spinelli, all these kind of people. This has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with the goal. It has nothing to do with Willy Brandt. It has very little to do with all this kind of stuff. It has to do with the layer that we were neglecting for a very long time, and to our fault, that is the Euro-Africa kind of project originally, that was projecting in a way, but is this something that can make the trick? Hopefully not. Hopefully not, in the sense that precisely what this leads to is to even more erode the social homogeneity of European societies. In a way, I mean, they call it military Keynesianism. I think it has very little to do with Keynes. Keynes was saying, half jokingly, that if you are in the depth of a crisis, it makes sense to dig holes in the ground He never said that it made sense to buy weapons from the US. In terms of the fiscal multiplier, holes in the ground are better than building an arms industry. Actually, I'm not making the joke. I mean, this is the question. At the very least, because you are not tempted to use the weapons at the end when you're having so much that you don't know what to do with them. So it's an attempt in order to, very obviously, but in a very superficial way. I mean, you remember, for example, Mario Monti, that was the commissioner for a very long time and then Prime Minister of Italy, and he has been very vocal in the metaphor of comparing the US being born out of war and Europe being born of war, and the war will be the war with Russia. But I think this is too cheap an argument. I mean, it goes for a TV interview and this kind of stuff, but this is something that hopefully, I think, clearly cannot work. I mean, the problem is deeper in a way, and we are seeing it, because we are afraid of the MAGA guys, but we are afraid also of the kind of developments that are happening one country after the other. I think at this point of time, we have a situation in which the first party in the polls in France is Rassemblement National. The first party in Germany is Alternative for Deutschland. In Portugal, it's not clear in the national elections if Chega would be the main party. We have here Vox at 15, 16, 17% polling. I think it's general. In Romania, the crazy guy did not win the elections, basically because he was totally incompetent. The day of the elections, he was in France, because he was pretending, and everybody knew he was in France. If you are running for president and the day of the elections you are in France, it's a very strange candidate that you are posing. And he was saying, I am fearing for my life. That's the reason that I am in the Champs-Élysées having a walk, I think that's something that is extremely problematic in this sense, and this says, but then we are moving beyond philosophy and law, we are moving into political science. There is a problem in terms of the selection of the elites in Europe, very obviously. I'm not a fan of elite governance and this kind of stuff, but we have now a problem with the political elites everywhere, I think.
Okay. I think for the hour it is, if there is no more question, if there are any questions around now, so we can finally call it today. Thank you very much for everyone for being here, and thank you both for this conversation.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.